The first knock sounded like an ordinary visitor. The second carried the weight of forgotten memories. But the third would uncover a promise that had quietly waited more than 20 years to be fulfilled. Rain fell steadily across the rolling hills outside Cedar Ridge, Missouri, turning the gravel driveway into a ribbon of shimmering gray beneath the fading evening sky. Ethan Walker balanced carefully on a ladder beside the weathered porch roof of his modest farmhouse, replacing loose shingles before another storm could make the old leak even worse. His flannel shirt was soaked through, his worn work boots were covered with mud, and every swing of his hammer reflected the quiet determination that had defined his life ever since he became both father and mother to his 8-year-old daughter. Inside the warm farmhouse, Lily sat near the living room window, drawing colorful pictures, while a pot of tomato soup slowly simmered on the stove, filling the house with a comforting aroma that reminded Ethan of the meals his own father had once prepared after long days of honest work. Life had never been easy, but Ethan had learned that peace was not measured by the size of a bank account. It was measured by the people waiting for you to come home. The sound of engines interrupted the peaceful rhythm of the rain. Ethan looked toward the narrow country road, just as two black luxury sport utility vehicles slowly turned into the driveway, their headlights cutting through the mist before stopping in front of the farmhouse. Nothing like that had ever visited Cedar Ridge without becoming the talk of the town. Ethan climbed down from the ladder, wiping rainwater from his face as the rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped onto the wet gravel wearing a cream-colored tailored coat over elegant business clothing. Even beneath the umbrella held above her by a driver, she carried herself with remarkable confidence. Yet there was something unexpectedly gentle in her blue eyes. She thanked the driver with a quiet smile before walking toward the porch alone, leaving the security of wealth several steps behind. Ethan met her halfway across the yard, uncertainty resting quietly between them. The woman studied his face for a long moment before speaking with a voice that was calm, respectful, and touched by emotion. "Does Samuel Walker still live here?" Ethan felt his heartbeat slow. Very few strangers ever spoke his father's name anymore. He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Samuel Walker was my father. He passed away 12 years ago." The woman's expression changed instantly. The strength she had carried across the driveway softened in a silent heartbreak. She closed her eyes as raindrops collected along the edge of her umbrella, almost as though she had been hoping the answer would somehow be different. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Only the steady rain filled the space between strangers whose lives had already been connected long before they met. Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached in her leather bag and carefully removed an old photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. The edges were worn with age, but the image remained unmistakable. A much younger version of the woman stood beside Samuel Walker outside a small roadside diner, both of them smiling beneath a bright autumn sky. Ethan stared at the photograph in complete disbelief. He had never seen it before. The woman looked up at him again, tears quietly gathering in her eyes without ever falling. "My name is Victoria Sterling," she said softly. "Your father changed my life when I had nothing left. I have spent 23 years searching for him." She paused, taking one slow breath before speaking the words that neither Ethan nor the quiet little farmhouse could have ever expected to hear. "I did not come here because of business. I came because I promised myself that if I ever found this family, I would repay what your father did for me." For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Victoria moved, as though the steady rain had frozen time around the little farmhouse. The old photograph remained between them, connecting two lives that had traveled separate roads for more than 2 decades before quietly crossing again on a rainy Missouri evening. Ethan finally stepped aside and opened the front door. "Please come in," said gently. "My father always believed nobody should stand outside in the rain." Victoria hesitated for only a second before following him inside. The warmth of the farmhouse wrapped around her immediately. The smell of homemade tomato soup drifted from the kitchen, while a small lamp beside the living room sofa cast a soft golden light across faded wooden floors polished by years of careful living. Nothing inside the house reflected wealth, yet every corner reflected love. Family photographs lined the walls beside handmade shelves filled with books, old tools, and small keepsakes collected over generations. Lily looked up from her drawing when the stranger entered. Her curious blue eyes settled on Victoria before she smiled politely, just as her father had taught her. "Hello," Lily said warmly. "Would you like some hot chocolate? Daddy says everybody feels better after something warm." Victoria blinked back unexpected emotion. Those words sounded painfully familiar. "I would love that," she answered softly. Lily hurried into the kitchen with cheerful determination, while Ethan invited Victoria to sit at the old oak dining table. Her eyes slowly wandered across the room until they rested on a framed portrait above the fireplace. Samuel Walker smiled exactly as she remembered him, wearing the same flannel shirt and gentle expression from the photograph she had carried for so many years. Victoria stood quietly and walked closer to the portrait. "He never changed," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "Not really. Even when life became difficult, he stayed the same man." Lily returned carrying a steaming mug of hot chocolate with both hands. Victoria accepted it carefully. The rich aroma of chocolate mixed with cinnamon instantly carried her back through years of forgotten memories. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug, allowing the heat to settle her racing thoughts. "Your father once told me that warm food reaches the heart before it reaches the stomach," she said almost to herself. Ethan looked at her with quiet surprise. That sounded exactly like something he would say. Victoria nodded slowly. Because he did. Silence filled the room once again, but this time it felt comforting instead of uncertain. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while the old farmhouse seemed to breathe with memories that had never truly disappeared. Victoria reached in her leather bag once more and carefully removed a small silver spoon wrapped inside a folded handkerchief. The polished surface had faded with age, but it remained carefully preserved. She placed it gently on the table. Ethan leaned forward. "What is this?" Victoria smiled through grateful eyes. "The last thing your father placed beside my dinner before he told me tomorrow could still become a beautiful day." Ethan studied the spoon with growing curiosity. It looked ordinary, yet Victoria handled it as though it were priceless. "I have carried this for 23 years, she continued quietly. "Not because it is valuable, but because every time I looked at it, I remembered the first person who saw me as someone worth saving instead of someone worth ignoring." Ethan remained silent. Every sentence sounded too sincere to question. Lily looked from the spoon to the portrait of her grandfather before asking the simple question that had been quietly waiting in the room since Victoria arrived. "When did Grandpa meet you?" Victoria took one slow breath and gently traced the edge of the silver spoon with her fingertips. Her eyes drifted toward the rain beyond the kitchen window, as though she could still see another storm from another lifetime. "I was 13 years old," she said softly. "I had nowhere to go, nothing to eat, and I believe the world had forgotten me. Then, one ordinary evening, your grandfather opened the door of a small roadside diner, looked at a frightened little girl sitting alone, and changed the direction of my entire life without ever asking for my name." Victoria held the silver spoon in her hands, as though it still carried the warmth of that forgotten evening. And when she began speaking again, her voice grew quieter, almost as if she were stepping back into another lifetime, one careful memory at a time. 23 years earlier, autumn had arrived early across northern Missouri. The evenings had already become cold enough to leave. Frost along empty sidewalks before sunrise, and 13-year-old Victoria wandered through a small town with no destination, wearing an oversized sweater that could not keep out the wind. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She passed brightly lit storefronts where families laughed together over dinner, careful never to look inside for too long, because hope could sometimes hurt more than hunger. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, she noticed the warm glow of a small roadside diner standing alone beside a two-lane highway. The smell of fresh bread and homemade soup drifted through the cool evening air, making her stomach ache with quiet desperation. She sat on a bench outside the entrance, trying not to attract attention while convincing herself she would leave before anyone asked questions. The front door opened, and a middle-aged man wearing a faded flannel shirt stepped outside, carrying a box of supplies. He noticed the frightened young girl immediately. He did not ask why she was there. He did not look at her with suspicion. He simply smiled the way people smile when they recognize another human being instead of a problem. "It is getting cold," he said kindly. "Would you like to come inside for a warm meal?" Victoria lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the invitation. "I do not have any money," she answered honestly. The man nodded once, as though her answer had never mattered. "That is fortunate," he replied with a gentle smile, "because I was not selling kindness tonight." He held the door open without another word. Something about his calm patience made fear lose its grip, and after a long hesitation, she quietly followed him inside. The little diner was nearly empty, except for an elderly couple sharing pie near the window and a truck driver finishing a cup of coffee before continuing his route. The man guided Victoria to a booth near the kitchen where the warmth felt almost unreal after hours outside in the cold. A waitress brought a bowl of chicken noodle soup, fresh bread with butter, mashed potatoes, and a slice of warm apple pie without asking for an order. Victoria stared at the meal, unable to believe it was meant for her. The man noticed her hesitation. "Go ahead," he said softly. Food tastes better when someone does not have to worry about earning it first. Victoria ate slowly at first, then with grateful relief as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. The man pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of privacy even in her most vulnerable moment. When she finally finished, he disappeared briefly before returning with a neatly folded flannel jacket and a bus ticket resting beside a polished silver spoon. "The jacket will help tonight," he explained. "The ticket will help tomorrow. The spoon is simply something to remind you that every new beginning starts with one ordinary meal." Victoria looked at him with disbelief. "Why are you doing this for me?" The man leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting comfortably on the table. His eyes reflected years of quiet wisdom earned through ordinary acts of compassion. "Because somebody once believed I was worth helping when I had very little," he answered. "The only way to thank them is to become that person for someone else." Before Victoria left, he walked her to the front door, where the cold autumn wind greeted them once again. As she turned to thank him, Samuel Walker smiled with the same peaceful expression that still watched over Ethan's farmhouse from the old portrait above the fireplace. Then he spoke the words that would quietly shape every decision she made for the next 23 years. "When life becomes beautiful again, do not spend your years searching for me. Find someone else who believes tomorrow is already too late, and remind them that hope still knows their name." The memory slowly faded as the rain outside Ethan's farmhouse came back into focus. Yet the silence around the dining table carried even greater meaning than before. Lily looked at the old silver spoon with wide eyes, trying to imagine her grandfather sitting across from a frightened little girl who would one day become one of the most successful business leaders in the country. Ethan remained quiet for several moments before asking the question that had quietly settled in his heart. "If my father told you not to spend your life searching for him, why did you?" Victoria smiled gently, her expression filled with both gratitude and humility. "Because sometimes gratitude is stronger than instructions." She wrapped both hands around the warm mug of hot chocolate and continued. "His kindness became the foundation of everything that followed. I finished school because someone believed tomorrow was worth preparing for. I earned scholarships because I refused to waste the opportunity he gave me. I built companies because every difficult decision reminded me that one act of compassion can create a future nobody else can see." She paused and glanced once more at Samuel's portrait above the fireplace. "But no matter how successful I became, I never forgot that my greatest investment was made by a man who expected absolutely nothing in return." Ethan listened without interrupting. He recognized the same quiet conviction that had guided his father throughout his own life. Victoria continued, her voice steady but softened by emotion. "When my first company finally succeeded, I hired private researchers to help me locate Samuel Walker. We searched old business records, property registrations, telephone directories, church membership lists, and county archives. Every lead ended with another question. Sometimes we arrived only days after someone had moved away. Other times the records had simply disappeared with the passing years. She smiled faintly at the memory. Technology became more advanced, but finding an ordinary man who never sought attention remained surprisingly difficult. The years passed. Victoria expanded her business across the country while quietly continuing the search whenever a new lead appeared. Every Christmas, she placed a carefully addressed envelope inside her office safe. Inside was a handwritten letter thanking Samuel, along with documents she hoped to deliver personally one day. Year after year, the envelope remained unopened, waiting for a meeting she believed would eventually happen. Then, nearly 6 months earlier, one of her researchers called with unexpected news. They had finally located a record matching Samuel Walker's name in Cedar Ridge, Missouri. Victoria immediately boarded a plane with hope filling her heart. She imagined surprising the man who had once changed her life with nothing more than a warm meal and gentle words. Instead, when she arrived at the county clerk's office, an elderly employee quietly searched through public records before looking at her with sympathetic eyes. "I am sorry," the woman had said. "Mr. Walker passed away 12 years ago." Victoria remembered standing completely still as those words settled into her heart. She had spent more than 2 decades believing there would always be another chance to say thank you. Suddenly, she realized that chance had quietly disappeared years before she even knew where to look. Before leaving Cedar Ridge that afternoon, she visited the small cemetery on the edge of town. Samuel's simple headstone reflected the same humble life he had always chosen. Fresh wildflowers rested beside the stone, showing that someone still visited often. Victoria placed the silver spoon beside the flowers for only a moment before carefully picking it up again. "I promised I would never leave this behind until I found the family he loved," she whispered at the grave. A kind groundskeeper noticed her standing there and gently mentioned that Samuel's son still lived at the old farmhouse outside town with his young daughter. Victoria returned to her hotel that evening without knocking on Ethan's door. She needed time to understand that the man she had hoped to embrace was gone forever. The following morning, she canceled every business meeting for the week, gathered the envelope that had waited 23 years inside her office safe, and drove through the rain toward the farmhouse, believing that although she could no longer thank the father who had saved her future, perhaps she could still honor his kindness by meeting the family who continued to live by the quiet example he left behind. The envelope rested quietly on the old oak table between them, its cream-colored paper untouched despite carrying the weight of 23 years of gratitude. Victoria placed one hand gently over it before looking at Ethan with sincere humility. "Everything inside belongs to your family," she said softly. "It was never meant for me to keep." Ethan did not reach for it. Instead, he waited patiently, allowing her to continue in her own time. Victoria slowly opened the envelope and carefully removed several neatly organized documents. The first was a certified letter from a local bank confirming that the remaining mortgage on Ethan's farmhouse could be paid in full immediately. The second outlined a fully funded college education trust for Lily, large enough to cover tuition, books, housing, and every expense she might face if she chose to attend any university in the country. The third described a financial investment that would provide Ethan with enough income to repair the farmhouse, reduce his workload, and spend more time raising his daughter without worrying about every unexpected bill. Finally, Victoria unfolded a handwritten letter she had written years earlier but had never been able to deliver. "Dear Mr. Walker," she read quietly, "you once spent less than $20 feeding a frightened little girl who had already lost faith in tomorrow. I cannot measure what your kindness became, because everything I have built stand upon that single evening. If success has any purpose, it is to become kindness that keeps traveling." She lowered the letter and looked at Ethan with hopeful eyes. "Please allow me to honor your father by giving this to the family he loved most." Silence settled gently over the room. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the old grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing second with calm certainty. Lily looked toward her father, waiting for his response. Ethan slowly gathered the documents into a neat stack before sliding them back across the table toward Victoria. She blinked in surprise. "You forgot to sign them," she said, believing perhaps he had misunderstood. Ethan smiled kindly and shook his head. "No, I understood everything." Victoria frowned slightly. "Then why are you giving them back?" Ethan rested his hands on the worn tabletop that his father had built decades earlier. His voice remained calm, carrying neither pride nor hesitation. "Because my father never helped people expecting life to return the favor." Victoria searched his face, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "This is not repayment," she answered gently. "This is gratitude." Ethan nodded with complete understanding. "I know. That is exactly why I cannot accept it." The words hung quietly between them. Victoria had negotiated billion-dollar agreements with some of the most influential executives in America, yet she had never encountered a refusal spoken with such peaceful conviction. Ethan looked towards Samuel's photograph above the fireplace before continuing. "When my father fixed a neighbor's fence, he did not send an invoice. When someone needed groceries, he never wrote down the cost. When he helped you, he believed the kindness ended the moment you stood back on your feet." He turned back toward Victoria with a gentle smile. "You already honored him. You built a life filled with purpose instead of bitterness. That is more valuable than anything inside this envelope." Victoria lowered her eyes, struggling to find words that had always come easily in boardrooms, but suddenly disappeared inside a humble farmhouse. She had imagined many possible conversations during the long drive to Cedar Ridge. She had prepared for tears, gratitude, even disbelief. She had never imagined someone refusing extraordinary generosity without the slightest trace of resentment or pride. Ethan quietly pushed the envelope another few inches toward her. "If you truly want to continue my father's legacy," he said softly, "do not bring kindness back to where it started. Carry it forward to someone who has not yet discovered that tomorrow can still become beautiful." Victoria looked at the untouched envelope, then at Samuel's smiling portrait, and for the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, she began to wonder whether the greatest lesson Samuel Walker had ever given her was not the meal she remembered, but the son he had quietly raised to live by exactly the same grace. Victoria remained seated, her fingers resting lightly on the unopened envelope, as though it had suddenly become far heavier than paper could possibly be. She had spent years imagining the moment she could finally express her gratitude, yet the quiet wisdom inside this modest farmhouse had gently dismantled every plan she had carefully prepared. Ethan poured another cup of hot chocolate and placed it in front of her without saying a word. His simple gesture reminded her so much of Samuel that she smiled despite the tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Your father was right," she said softly. "Kindness really does speak louder when nobody is trying to be noticed." Ethan looked toward the rain outside the kitchen window before answering. "He used to tell me that kindness is like a river. If you try to force it to flow backward, it loses its purpose. It is supposed to keep moving forward until it reaches someone who is still waiting." Victoria nodded slowly, allowing those words to settle deep within her heart. For years, she had believed gratitude meant returning everything to the person who had first given hope. Now she realized that true gratitude meant becoming another beginning in someone else's story. Lily quietly picked up her crayons again and continued drawing at the table. After a few minutes, she held up the picture she had just finished. It showed 3 people standing beneath a rainbow outside the farmhouse, holding hands while bright flowers covered the field around them. Above the drawing, she had carefully written in uneven letters, "Grandpa helps everybody." Victoria laughed gently through moist eyes. "He still does," she whispered. Before anyone could speak again, another knock echoed across the farmhouse. Ethan stood and opened the front door to find an elderly man wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a small cedar box tucked carefully beneath one arm. His silver hair was damp from the rain, but his friendly smile immediately brightened the room. "I hope I am not interrupting supper," he said warmly. Ethan smiled. "Never, Harold. Come inside." Harold Benson had been Samuel Walker's closest friend for more than 40 years. He removed his cap respectfully before stepping into the house, then stopped when he noticed Victoria sitting beside the dining table. His thoughtful eyes moved from her face to the old silver spoon resting near the empty mug. For a brief moment, he seemed to understand something without anyone needing to explain it. "Well," Harold said quietly, "I believe this must be the visitor Samuel wondered about." Victoria looked up in surprise. "He wondered about me?" Harold chuckled softly as he set the cedar box on the table with remarkable care. "Not by name. He never knew your name. But after helping that young girl all those years ago, he told me one afternoon while we were repairing the church roof that sometimes kindness travels farther than people ever imagine." Harold gently brushed his hand across the smooth wooden lid before continuing. He smiled and said, "One day someone might come looking for me. If I am gone by then, tell them not to be disappointed. Tell them the real gift is still ahead of them." Victoria felt a quiet shiver run through her heart. Ethan looked at Harold with curiosity. "You never told me that." Harold nodded slowly. "Because your father also asked me to wait until the right person arrived." The room fell completely silent except for the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock and the soft rhythm of rain against the windows. Harold carefully turned the small brass key in the cedar box and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a piece of neatly folded blue cloth, lay an old silver pocket watch whose polished surface reflected the warm light from the kitchen. Victoria covered her mouth in astonishment. She recognized the watch immediately, and the expression on her face told Ethan and Lily that whatever story they thought had finally reached its ending had, in truth, only just begun. Victoria slowly reached toward the silver pocket watch, but her fingertips stopped just short of touching it, as though even the smallest movement might disturb a memory that had waited decades to return home. Her eyes never left the familiar engraving on the back. It was a tiny oak tree surrounded by the words, "Stand with quiet dignity." She closed her eyes for a brief moment before whispering, "I found this watch almost 20 years ago." Ethan and Harold exchanged surprised glances, while Lily leaned closer with innocent curiosity. Harold folded his hands over his cane and smiled gently. "Tell us." "How?" Victoria looked down at the watch, and another memory quietly unfolded. Nearly 3 years after Samuel had helped her, she was working after school cleaning offices in Kansas City. Every dollar mattered because she was determined to finish high school without depending on anyone else. One snowy evening, she noticed a silver pocket watch lying beside a bench near a bus station. She waited there for nearly an hour, hoping someone would return looking for it, but nobody ever came. Inside the cover, she discovered the same engraved oak tree along with Samuel Walker's initials. She immediately remembered the watch resting in his shirt pocket the night he bought her dinner. She carried it to the local police station and left her contact information, believing the owner would eventually be found. Months passed without a single phone call. When the legal waiting period ended, the watch was returned to her because nobody had claimed it. From that day forward, she kept it safely stored beside the silver spoon, convinced that one day she would place both treasures back into Samuel's hands. Harold nodded slowly, as though every missing piece had finally found its proper place. "That explains something Samuel never understood," he said quietly. "About 2 years after helping you, he told me he had lost the only thing his own father left him. He searched everywhere, but finally accepted that perhaps someone else needed it more than he did." Victoria looked at the watch with tears quietly shining in her eyes. "I searched for him as hard as I searched for the owner of this watch. Somehow both journeys were waiting for today." Harold carefully lifted the pocket watch from the cedar box and placed it gently into Victoria's hands. "Then I believe you should be the one to finish the journey." Victoria immediately shook her head and turned toward Ethan. "No," she answered softly. "This belongs with his family." Ethan accepted the watch with both hands, studying the worn silver surface that his father had never spoken about losing. He slowly opened the cover and listened. To everyone's surprise, The old mechanism was still ticking with quiet determination after all those years. Lily smiled brightly. It sounded alive. Ethan looked at his daughter and nodded. Maybe that is what Grandpa wanted us to hear. Harold reached in the cedar box once more and removed a neatly folded piece of yellowed paper tied with a simple blue ribbon. Unlike the watch, the paper had Ethan's name written clearly across the front in Samuel's familiar handwriting. Ethan stared at the envelope without moving. "You never told me about this," he whispered. Harold's voice became almost reverent. "Because he asked me to keep it sealed until the day someone arrived, carrying both gratitude and the silver spoon." Victoria covered her mouth in astonishment. Ethan carefully accepted the letter, recognizing every curve of his father's handwriting as though no time had passed at all. The room grew perfectly still while the rain outside began to soften into a gentle drizzle. The ticking pocket watch rested in Ethan's palm. The silver spoon remained beside Victoria's cup, and one unopened letter quietly waited to reveal the final lesson Samuel Walker had prepared long before any of them knew this extraordinary evening would ever come. The old paper crackled softly as Ethan untied the faded blue ribbon. And for a brief moment, nobody spoke because every person in the farmhouse understood that they were about to hear the voice of a man whose kindness had quietly reached beyond his own lifetime. Ethan unfolded the letter with careful hands and immediately recognized the familiar handwriting that had once filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and simple notes left on the kitchen table after early mornings at work. He swallowed gently before reading aloud. "To my son, if you are holding this letter, then life has already written the ending that I could never know. Perhaps someone has come looking for me. Perhaps they have carried gratitude much farther than I ever imagined. If that is true, welcome them with the same respect you would offer any neighbor who knocks on your door. They are not arriving because they owe me anything. They are arriving because kindness has finally completed a long journey." Ethan paused, his voice growing quieter as emotion settled over the room. Outside, the rain had almost completely stopped, leaving only the occasional drop falling from the porch roof onto the damp ground below. He continued reading. "If they bring gifts, do not feel guilty for refusing them if your heart tells you that kindness should continue traveling forward instead of circling back. I never believed generosity was a debt that needed collecting. A good deed becomes smaller the moment it expects repayment. Its real purpose is to inspire another good deed somewhere farther down the road." Victoria lowered her eyes, each sentence gently confirming everything Ethan had tried to explain only minutes before. Samuel's wisdom had not disappeared with him. It was still shaping lives through words written long before this evening had ever arrived. Ethan turned the page and continued. "There is one favor I hope you will ask instead. Tell the person sitting across from you that somewhere tonight another frightened child, another struggling parent, another lonely neighbor believes tomorrow has already given up on them. Ask them to become the answer to that person's prayer. If they truly wish to honor my memory, let them build second chances instead of monuments. Let them create opportunities instead of obligations. Let them open doors that someone else believes will never open again." Harold quietly removed his glasses and wiped away tears that had gathered despite his gentle smile. Lily looked toward her father with thoughtful eyes. "Grandpa wanted kindness to keep moving," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly without taking his eyes from the letter. Only a few lines remained. "My son, remember that dignity is never measured by what a person owns. It is measured by how they treat someone who cannot repay them. Grace is never loud. Respect never demands applause. Redemption begins with one ordinary decision to care about another human being. If my watch ever finds its way home and the spoon returns with it, then you will know that hope always remembers the road back. Smile for me, close this letter, and begin another story that has nothing to do with me." Ethan lowered the paper as complete silence settled across the farmhouse. The old pocket watch continued its gentle ticking on the table beside the silver spoon, almost as though both had been waiting patiently for Samuel's final lesson to be heard. Victoria slowly reached for the envelope she had carried for 23 years, then looked at Ethan with peaceful certainty instead of disappointment. She quietly slid every document back inside before closing it once more. "I understand now," she said with a grateful smile. "This was never meant to become a gift for one family. It was meant to become hope for many families." Harold smiled knowingly. Ethan folded his father's letter with quiet reverence. And as the last clouds drifted away from the Missouri sky, each of them realized that Samuel Walker's greatest inheritance had never been something that could be placed inside a box. It had always been the courage to give another person a second chance before they even believed they deserved one. 1 year later, the old farmhouse still stood beneath the same wide Missouri sky, but something remarkable had quietly spread far beyond its weathered porch. The gravel driveway welcomed more visitors than it ever had before, not because people came searching for success, but because they had heard about a place where second chances were treated with dignity instead of judgment. The envelope Victoria had once hoped to leave with Ethan had never disappeared. Instead, it had become the first page of a much larger story. Together, Ethan, Victoria, Harold, and several trusted members of the Cedar Ridge community had transformed its contents into the Samuel Walker Second Chance Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping struggling single parents, young students facing impossible financial burdens, and hardworking families rebuilding their lives after unexpected hardship. Every scholarship, every emergency grant, every apprenticeship, and every meal shared through the foundation carried the same quiet principles Samuel had lived by. No repayment was expected, only the hope that kindness would continue traveling forward. On a bright Saturday morning during the annual Harvest Festival, children laughed beneath colorful banners while local musicians filled the town square with familiar songs. Farmers displayed fresh produce, neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles, and volunteers served homemade pie beside long wooden tables where nobody cared about titles or bank accounts. Near the center of the celebration stood a modest brick building with a simple bronze plaque beside its entrance. It did not bear the name of a corporation or a wealthy donor. It simply read, Samuel Walker Second Chance Foundation. Quiet dignity. Endless grace. Victoria stood several steps away from the entrance, dressed far more simply than she had been on the rainy evening she first arrived at the farmhouse. She watched as a young mother received assistance for nursing school, while her little son proudly held a backpack filled with brand-new school supplies. Nearby, an older veteran shook Ethan's hand after learning that a local apprenticeship program had offered him meaningful work. Across the courtyard, several high school seniors smiled through grateful tears as they accepted scholarship letters that would allow them to attend college without carrying overwhelming financial burdens. Victoria realized that not one of those people knew her net worth, her business accomplishments, or the size of the original envelope. None of those things mattered here. What mattered was that hope had quietly found another address. Lily, now 1 year older and a little taller, ran toward Victoria carrying a freshly baked cookie wrapped in a napkin. "Daddy says Grandpa would not let anyone leave hungry," she said with a bright smile. Victoria accepted the cookie with grateful laughter. "Your grandfather continues to teach all of us." Ethan joined them a moment later, holding the old silver pocket watch in one hand. It had been carefully restored, yet every small scratch remained exactly where time had placed it. The watch still ticked with calm determination, reminding him every day that some things were never meant to become perfect. They were meant to become meaningful. Back at the farmhouse that evening, the four friends gathered around the same oak table where everything had quietly changed one rainy night a year earlier. Samuel's letter rested beside the silver spoon, and the pocket watch continued marking each peaceful second. Nobody felt the need to speak for a while. The silence itself seemed full of gratitude. Finally, Harold smiled and looked towards Samuel's portrait above the fireplace. "You were right, old friend," he said softly. "Kindness really does know the way home." Ethan glanced at his daughter, then at Victoria, before carefully closing his father's letter once again. Outside, the setting sun covered the fields with warm golden light as a gentle breeze moved through the tall grass surrounding the farmhouse. Nothing about the land appeared extraordinary, Yet countless lives had already been changed because one ordinary man had once opened a diner door for a frightened little girl without expecting anything in return. His name would eventually fade from public memory, as every human name eventually does. But his grace would continue living wherever one person chose compassion over indifference, dignity over pride, and hope over despair, proving that the greatest legacy any heart can leave behind is not the wealth it gathers, but the second chances it quietly places into the hands of strangers.